How you doing, guys? Anybody who knows me personally realizes I'm pretty much an even-tempered person. I've gained that with age. I rarely lose my temper, maybe once a year. I don't like yelling. I don't complain about anything because complaining doesn't do any good. It's not to say that I don't have anything that triggers me. That happens very, very rarely. Certain type of personalities do tend to get under my skin and trigger me. And it was in 2006 I was dealing with two of them simultaneously. One of them was a guy I worked with. We would fight tooth and nail on a daily basis. This went on for 7 years. And that includes fisticuffs. The other person was my Bible instructor. Now basically they both had the same thing in common. They were both control freaks. Now the one thing my employer didn't understand, when I go home, my life is none of your business. But this is the type of person he was. And my Bible instructor was virtually the same thing. The only difference was my employer had a certain physicality. I mean, we would butt heads, and he was a very powerful individual. My Bible instructor couldn't fight his way out of a wet paper bag. But nonetheless, their personalities set me off. Certain things they would say. And this was something I never noticed until that point. See, when I was growing up, I lacked one thing growing up, and that was self-confidence. See, I grew up in a very abusive household. I don't go on about my past very often, but for this video I opted to. My father was extremely abusive, both physically and verbally. As the years went by, the physical didn't do so much damage after a while. As a matter of fact, I developed a very high tolerance for pain. The verbal was something that stuck with me for a very long time, which is why I'm a firm believer you have to be very careful what you say. Think about choosing your words because you can have a long-term effect. My father for so many years would say them so often that I started believing them. So, right through school, right through most of my young life, I lacked that self-confidence because I believed what he said was true. And this went right into my marriage, which was failed to begin with. Funny thing was, I had said to my wife more times, what would you think about leaving the area? It had always been in the back of my mind, pack up and go. For the reason being, my family knew so many people in this city that my own life was never my own life. I moved out at a young age, but it didn't seem to matter. Wherever I went, they seemed to be on top of it. They knew who I was with, where I was, and I'm like, let me live my life. So I'd said to my wife more often than not, what would you think about moving out of the area? And her response was always the same. It's like, no, I don't want to move away from my family. Okay, see, her family had more input on my household than I did. And that was a fail from the get-go. She couldn't understand that I just wanted out of the area. I wanted to start a new life elsewhere where she did not. She was stuck. She was married to her family. She wasn't married to me. Shortly after we were divorced, I says, okay, I'm going to start living my life. And the situation with my family never changed. Again, I still had very little self-confidence, but I was trying to work on that on my own. And it was one night I stopped by at my family's house to visit them, and they said to me, oh, we heard you were at Victoria Station last night. Yeah. And they gave me a rundown on the girl I was with. And I'm like, I just went there to have a few drinks with her. I'm not marrying her. My father's response was, well, you better get married real soon. And I'm like, why? I just got out of a bad situation. I don't want to get back into another one. But as this next year went by, their input was getting overwhelming, and their condescending comments told me was starting to take its toll to the point where one night I just said, I got to get out of here. There were no goodbyes, no fanfare. I just packed up and I left. Now, knowing full well that they're very good at tracking people, I opted to travel west. Several months later, I traveled south. Left no forwarding address, no phone number to reach me at. I just vanished. It was probably a shitty thing to do, but it was something I had to do at that time. So when I finally got to my destination, the next year was hell. Financially, it was terrible. I'm getting used to the new area. I had basically no allies, so I was basically on my own. And I hit many brick walls. And it was always in the back of my mind, should I go home? Should I go back? And the answer always came back, no, because nothing has changed there. Over the next few years, I learned to compensate, and I pretty much did it on my own. Not to say I didn't have other brick walls hit me, and I mean, I had good times and I had some bad times. And every time I hit those bad times, it would come back to in the back of my head, should I go home? And the answer was always no. About 6 years had passed, and my family and I finally made contact, and we're calling back and forth, and we're writing back and forth for a few years, but nothing serious. I mean, I didn't let them in too much what I was doing or where I was at, and they had no connections where I'm at, so they didn't have anybody to tell them, so I was fine with that. It was about the year 2000. I got a letter in the mail that my brother was getting married, and they asked if I could come up for the wedding. I'm like, hell yeah. So I made arrangements to fly up. I opted to stay for about 3 weeks, and that in itself, looking back, was the world's biggest mistake. I got off the plane, they picked me up at Logan Airport, and we went back to the house, and the initial hellos were fine, and we were all happy, just joking, talking back and forth. After the initial hellos, where do you go to from here? And I'm looking at everybody. Everybody was much older, but the conversations were virtually the same. The funny thing was, the quietest one in the room was my father. He didn't have a whole lot to say. I mean, he was being very cordial, but was not saying very much. And I knew, okay, he and I are going to have that conversation somewhere during the course of the day. But after the initial hellos, I'm already looking at the calendar, counting my days when to go back. Now, towards the end of the day, my father says, I'm going to drive your grandfather home. Do you want to go for a ride? I said, sure. I figured this is when we're going to have the conversation. So we drove and we dropped my grandfather off. On the way back, things got very quiet for about 5 minutes. Then my father asked me the one question, why? Well, I owed him that much. Why I did what I did, why I vanished the way I did without a trace. And we had a conversation about it, and I told him I had to do what I had to do. I just needed to gain my own space and my own life. I figured he was going to rip into me about it. And he says to me, you know, I don't think I had the balls to do that. I didn't take that as an insult, and I don't think he meant it as one. Matter of fact, that was the first compliment I think I've ever gotten from the guy. We had talked a little further, and he was going on about the mistakes he had made with me growing up. So he admitted where he was at fault, inexperience on his part, financial frustration, and I seemed to be the perfect punching bag for him, which he admitted was a big mistake. I was no angel either because I had a very smart mouth as a kid, so more often than not I deserved that backhander. For the remainder of my time there, my father was a totally different person. There was no abusive comments from him. He was just very, very, much like I am today, very calm. What I picked up on while I was there was something that I had never noticed when I was younger. Other members of my family were more passive-aggressive. Their conversations were virtually the same as they were when I was growing up, and I had never picked up on it. See, it took me all those years away to develop self-confidence, and I was amazed how fast it was picked apart when I went home for those 3 weeks. But it wasn't coming from my father. It was coming from other members of my family who were saying things to me very passive-aggressively. See, at the time, I was working out like a bull. The rest of my family tended to be overweight. Well, they thought I looked sick. That was the first thing. Other things were said that little by little started chipping away at my self-confidence. By the time I flew back home, and yes, I say home because it is now, I pretty much had decided never to go back. But I was not the same for months. I had realized that that one short visit had totally demolished my self-esteem. So they asked me, because they were under the assumption that I was moving back, just because I went for a visit. I made it clear, no. And deep in my head, I'm thinking, no, because nothing here has changed. I have my own life elsewhere. Coming back here would go right back to where I was before. Nothing has changed. So I opted not to go back. I've thought about it over the years, what would happen if I did go back. Things would be virtually the same. As a matter of fact, generally the second time around is probably worse than the first. My family basically remembered me, how do I put it? They actually knew nothing about me. Because the thing is, while I was visiting them, I didn't say a lot. Now, at the time, when I was younger, I was very talkative. Remember, my brother said to me, he says, well, you never really did say much anyways. And I'm like, wow, you don't even know me. Well, I opted not to go back. I live my life here. They live their life there. Would it benefit me to go back? In a lot of ways, it would. I mean, financially, definitely. They have connections that I could use. Down here, I'm pretty much on my own. But this is the way I have to do it. I never liked people sticking their nose where it didn't belong. And with my family, that's the way it was. The reason I bring this up, because I'm wondering, 2020 has been a very, very crucial year. And I'm wondering how many ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, because of everything that's going on in the political theater in this country and around the world, are going to go running right back to the Kingdom Hall. I was watching a YouTuber who's not very well known. He's very low-key. And he was going on about he's walking away from the ex-JW community, which there's no problem in that. Let's face it, the ex-JW community is a temporary stopover for people. It's nothing permanent. It's simply a doorway to get out of Watchtower and go and develop your own life. But I'm wondering how many people this year are considering going back to the Kingdom Hall. I mean, let's face it, there's something that hits all of us every so often in the back of our minds when we leave Watchtower. What if they're right? Every one of us has thought about that at one time or another. Probably not very often, because we left to begin with. But unfortunately, Watchtower is playing up on current events. They still use that fear factor. I didn't realize how badly my self-confidence and self-esteem was being waylaid when I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses. I never realized until after I had left that they were using the same passive-aggressive tactics that certain members of my family did. And that was something I kind of like to drown out, but apparently some of it actually did get in. And my Bible instructor, he was the type of personality that just triggers me. People like him, I like to avoid. Matter of fact, to this day, I still would love to slap the taste right out of his mouth. But I'm just wondering just how many people. If you are one of these people who are considering going back, the other thing I want to mention, the infighting with the ex-JW community, is not abnormal. It's going to happen. When people have their newfound freedom, they have different of opinions, something that what Jehovah's Witnesses aren't allowed to have. So there is bound to be infighting. There is bound to be disagreements, if not outright hostilities. That is normal. And don't think that Jehovah's Witnesses don't have disagreements and hostilities amongst themselves, because they do. But if you're considering going back, think about one thing. All the reasons, the child abuse, their affiliation with the UN, their ever-changing doctrines. And the one most important thing is the reason you left to begin with, because nothing has changed there. Whatever the reason was that you had left, It's still going on. And the second time going back somewhere is always worse than the first. Oh, for the first few weeks it'll be fine. They'll all be happy to see you. But just remember how many times you were shunned, whether because you were disassociated, whether you were disfellowshipped, whether you were mocked. These people have not changed. So if it's in the back of your mind that maybe they're right, things are going to go on whether you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses or not. But just keep in mind why you left. And is your life better today than it was when you were one of Jehovah's Witnesses? That's something else you may want to give some thought to. Life is always going to be tough. It doesn't matter if you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses or not. It's tough for everybody. And 2020 is happening to us all. Anyways, guys, that's just something I wanted to bring to your attention. And I will talk to you soon. And feel free to leave your comments below.